"I know what it means," said the maid's son. The millionaire laughed scornfully in front of everyone. But no one imagined that, in just a few minutes, that humble boy would change the course of the meeting and silence even the most powerful. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to help us bring you more moving stories that impact lives. Thank you. The main hall of Hawthorne Global Enterprises was packed. Executives in impeccable suits, foreign investors, and renowned consultants occupied every corner of the luxurious room, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that reflected the grandeur of the power present. In the center, millionaire Augustus Hawthorne, with his imposing posture and superior look, held in his hands an international contract shrouded in mystery. The document contained codes and symbols that no one had yet been able to decipher. Tension grew as the minutes passed. Everyone knew that millions of dollars depended on this contract, but no one dared step forward. An awkward silence hung over the room. Augustus, visibly irritated, paced back and forth, glaring at his executives as if searching for someone to blame for their inefficiency. "Is no one here capable of explaining what this means?" His voice echoed, thick with contempt. The men glanced at each other, some lowering their heads, others pretending to shuffle papers to escape their boss's penetrating gaze. It was humiliating. So many years of study, so many diplomas hanging on the walls, and none of them had the courage or skill to decipher those mysterious lines. Augustus's frustration grew by the second, and with it the heaviness of the atmosphere in the room. It was then that an unexpected voice broke the silence. It came from the back of the room, soft but firm enough to make everyone turn around. Among the expensive uniforms and neatly lined ties, the unlikely figure of Elias Duarte emerged, a boy of just 13, dressed in simple, weather-worn clothes. His gaze, however, held conviction, not fear. "I know what you mean, sir," he declared without hesitation. The murmur that spread among the suits was immediate. Snickers, mocking glances, and even expressions of astonishment filled the room. Augustus frowned, staring at the boy as if he'd heard the most insolent thing of his life. At that moment, no one imagined that the words spoken by the maid's son would change the fate of everyone present. The room erupted in muffled laughter. Some executives clapped their hands over their mouths to hide their mockery. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Augustus, standing before the boy, raised an eyebrow with an expression of utter contempt. His tailored suit reflected the light from the chandelier, but it was his cold gaze that dominated the room. He leaned forward slightly, as if to say something confidential, but his voice echoed for all to hear. "A poor boy like you would never understand something so complex. You're nothing more than an intruder in this room." The sarcasm laden with every syllable seemed to outweigh the silence that followed. Elias, motionless, didn't look away. There was mockery on every face around him, and the social divide seemed even more striking in that contrast. The boy in simple clothes, face to face with men in ties, doctors, and millionaires. An executive in the corner of the room let out a louder laugh, which spread like a spark among the others. Augustus couldn't contain his ironic smile, crossed his arms, and added, "Did you hear? The maid's son thinks he can decipher what our best experts couldn't." The words carried venom, but also insecurity masked by arrogance. Helena Duarte, Elias's mother, watched from the doorway, her heart heavy. The cleaning cloth still in her hands felt like it weighed a ton. She wanted to run and silence her son, protect him from the shame he was about to suffer. But something inside her told her not to intervene. Elias's firm gaze contrasted with the laughter of the elite surrounding him. Augustus turned his back on the boy, as if he had closed the matter. "I've wasted enough time on nonsense," he muttered. But little did he know that this innocent boldness would spark a turnaround that no one, absolutely no one in that room, could have foreseen. From the half-open door, Helena Duarte watched the scene with teary eyes. Her blue uniform was already stained with dust from polished furniture and hours of work, and her rubber gloves still hung loosely on her tired hands. She shouldn't be there. Protocol dictated that employees remain invisible, away from big business. But as a mother, her heart wouldn't allow her to leave. With each mocking word hurled at Elias, she felt her chest tighten, as if the insults were directed at herself. It was her son, her pride and her life, being ridiculed in front of men who thought they owned the world. Helena bit her lip, fighting the urge to intervene. She wanted to scream, to grab Elias by the arm and drag him away before the humiliation became worse. But her heavy breathing betrayed the internal battle between fear and hope. She knew, deep down, that her son had gifts no one could imagine. Since he was little, Elias had spent his nights hunched over borrowed books, scribbling in old notebooks, deciphering symbols and formulas as if they were toys. How many times had she found him asleep on pages illuminated only by the dim light of a candle? Now, all that hidden knowledge became a target for mockery. But there was something different in the boy's eyes. Helena noticed that Elias didn't tremble, didn't flinch, or cower in the face of Augustus's arrogance. He stood firm, as if within him lay a strength greater than fear. And that paralyzed her. The words stuck in her throat wouldn't come out. The cleaning cloth slipped from her fingers, falling to the floor without her noticing. It was as if a silent voice told her to wait, to trust. Helena, then, simply clenched her hands into discreet fists, took a deep breath, and decided. She wouldn't stop him. Her son was about to write his own story, and she would witness every line. Elias took a deep breath. The stares surrounding him were like invisible arrows, each one filled with disdain, mockery, or disbelief. The boy could have backed away, could have swallowed his words and accepted his status as the maid's son, but he didn't. In a firm voice, he repeated, "Sir, I can decipher these codes." The silence that followed was even heavier than the previous laughter. It was as if the air had become thick, difficult to breathe. Some executives whispered among themselves, trying to hide their discomfort. Others stared at Augustus, awaiting his reaction, like soldiers awaiting a general's order. The boy's boldness was disturbing, but at the same time, it aroused curiosity. How could someone so young, dressed so simply and without a diploma, maintain such conviction in front of men who considered themselves intellectuals? Elias didn't back down, his steady eyes shining with a courage no one expected. He knew this was his moment, even if the whole world was against him. "Let me prove it," he asked in a respectful yet confident tone. The entire room held its breath, and even the laughter, once so abundant, gradually died down, giving way to silent anticipation. Augustus narrowed his eyes, irritated by the insistence. For him, this had already crossed the line of what was acceptable. Still, the millionaire realized that if he ignored the boy, his authority might appear weakened in front of those present. So, with a brusque gesture and a wry smile, he pulled the contract from the table and held it out to Elias. "Well, kid, if you think you can do it, prove it to us all." The document landed in the boy's small hands as if it were a burden too heavy. But Elias didn't hesitate. His firm fingers glided over the paper, and a gleam appeared in his eyes that no one could decipher. In that instant, the entire room realized something was about to happen. Augustus handed the contract to Elias as if setting a trap. The gesture was accompanied by a smile laden with sarcasm, the kind of smile that mocks, that diminishes, that reduces the other to nothing. He crossed his arms and took a few steps back, projecting his voice for all to hear. "Let's see how bold this boy is. Show us, son of a maid, since you think you're smarter than men educated at the best universities in the world." Malicious chuckles echoed from some executives, pleased to witness what they believed to be Elias's imminent downfall. The silent bet in that room was that the boy would crumble in seconds, crushed by the weight of the challenge. Elias, however, didn't back down. His fingers touched the pages, tracing the complex symbols and codes with the serenity of someone recognizing an old acquaintance. The boy, who had so often been ignored within that mansion, now became the center of attention. Every gaze was fixed on him, some filled with contempt, others with unexpected curiosity. Helena, standing in the doorway, felt her heart race in her chest, as if with each beat something might collapse. The silence in the room was almost deafening, interrupted only by the sound of paper being handled. It was the calm before the storm. Augustus watched with a furrowed brow, waiting for the moment when Elias would hesitate, freeze, or apologize for his insolence. But seeing the boy's firmness, something inside him stirred. The millionaire, accustomed to being the absolute center of respect and obedience, began to feel the uncomfortable pang of his own wounded pride. He couldn't allow this scene to become a threat to his authority. "Come on, kid, we don't have all day," he snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. Elias slowly lifted his eyes from the paper, looked Augustus straight in the eye, and took a deep breath. The entire room awaited his next move, and it was impossible to predict what would come next. Elias stared at the contract for a few moments while the room waited impatiently. The silence was so heavy that each second seemed to drag. Then, suddenly, the boy began sliding his finger across the lines of code, as if reading a common story. His voice, firm and clear, broke the tense atmosphere. "This section here mentions a hidden clause. If it's not corrected, the company will lose millions." The murmur that spread was immediate. Some executives looked at each other in disbelief, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. One of the consultants tried to interrupt, coughing nervously, but Elias didn't stop. With the ease of someone who had done this many times before, he continued explaining line by line, unraveling symbols that, until a few minutes before, had seemed indecipherable. The conviction in his speech contrasted with his humble appearance, worn clothes, scuffed shoes, and a look of determination. Each explanation he gave drew expressions of astonishment from the suited men. Helena, still motionless near the door, brought her hands to her mouth to stifle a sob. Her son, the boy who had grown up in the shadow of the mansion, was leaving all these powerful men speechless. Augustus, until then relaxed in his chair, began to feel uneasy. The sneers slowly faded, replaced by a visible tension in his expression. He tried to interrupt the boy. "This proves nothing," he exclaimed, but Elias's firmness and the investor's gazes no longer allowed his voice to carry the same weight. The entire room was immersed in the strange sensation of witnessing something historic, something that would change everything. Elias, without missing a beat, looked up for a moment, stared at the room, and said, "I can continue, if you'd like." The sentence echoed like an unexpected challenge. And in that moment, even the most skeptical realized the improbable was happening before them. The room, previously dominated by muffled laughter and mocking expressions, was now plunged into an almost reverent silence. The eyes that had previously turned to Augustus for approval now fixed on Elias, following every word and explanation the boy gave with a mixture of astonishment and admiration. The ironic smile that had formed at the corner of the millionaire's mouth slowly faded, like a flame suffocated by the gale. It was impossible to ignore. The maid's son was dominating the scene. The power of arrogance that had sustained Augustus was beginning to crumble in the face of something much stronger, the truth spoken with conviction. Executives who had previously leaned back in their chairs, confident in their superiority, now leaned forward, eager to hear more. One of them even discreetly took his cell phone out of his pocket, as if to record this historic moment. The room that minutes ago had seemed like a courtroom about to sentence Elias now became a makeshift classroom, with everyone in suits surrendered to the boy's unexpected knowledge. Helena, motionless, discreetly wiped away a tear that insisted on rolling down her face. Her son, so often invisible, was now the only voice that mattered. Augustus, feeling his control slipping from his grasp, gripped the armrest tightly. A blush crept up his face, betraying the mixture of fury and disbelief he tried to hide behind a forced expression of neutrality. He took a deep breath, as if searching for a way to regain his authority, but every word Elias said seemed to push him into a tighter corner. The entire room sensed the change. The one who always had the last laugh now had the most to lose. When Elias looked up and, without hesitation, pointed out yet another hidden error in the contract, Augustus's heart raced. The humiliation he so desperately wanted to inflict was returning to him, and everyone present knew it. Helena stood motionless near the door, but inside her heart was on fire. Her hands, still covered in the marks of her work, trembled slightly as she watched her son's every gesture. Elias, her boy, the one who had grown up among old books, scribbled notebooks, and sleepless nights, was now in the center of a room where he should never have been. With each firm word, each deciphered line, Helena felt a mixture of relief and pride so intense she could barely breathe. It was like watching an impossible dream take shape before dozens of incredulous eyes. Memories came rushing back. How many times had she found him sitting at the makeshift kitchen table, a dim candle illuminating yellowed pages? How many times had she had to ask for silence so as not to wake the bosses, while Elias insisted on studying until dawn? She remembered when he'd said, as a child, that symbols and numbers seemed to speak to him, that they weren't enemies, but enigmas waiting to be understood. In that moment, Helena realized that all the effort, every sacrifice, every hour of double work to support her son was worth it. Elias wasn't just a curious boy. He was someone destined to challenge the impossible. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of pain, but of pride. As the executives leaned in to listen better and Augustus tried in vain to hide his discomfort, Helena pressed her hands to her chest, as if to hold back her heart that felt like it was bursting. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The brightness in her eyes spoke louder than any speech. Elias wasn't alone. There was an invisible force sustaining him, and that force was his mother's silent love. When he lifted his face and cast a quick glance in her direction, Helena simply smiled through her tears. It was as if she were saying without speaking, "Keep going, my son. The world is finally listening to you." One of the executives, unable to contain his curiosity, raised his voice. "But how could you possibly know that, kid? Where did you learn it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but also an involuntary acknowledgement. Elias looked up from the contract and directly at the suited men surrounding him. His expression was calm, but carried the firmness of someone who had faced far greater trials than this. "I taught myself," he replied. The murmur that spread was immediate, like a wave that swept through the entire room. Elias continued, undaunted. "While many slept, I spent nights in the public library. I picked up used books, forgotten notebooks, and studied until every symbol made sense. I had no teachers, no private lessons, just the desire to understand what no one wanted to teach me." His words echoed with a sincerity no degree could offer. The executives, once full of arrogance, now looked at each other in silence, some visibly uncomfortable. It was impossible to ignore that this boy carried within him a discipline that many of them, with all their money and resources, had never achieved. Helena felt a lump in her throat when she heard that. How many times had she tried to convince him to rest? How many times had she found him sleeping on worn books, his body exhausted and his eyes still glued to the pages? Now, in front of millionaires and investors, Elias's dedication became apparent. His mother held back tears, while some present, for the first time, showed a look of true respect. The silence that dominated the room was no longer one of mockery, but of reverence. And deep down, even Augustus realized, this boy wasn't just the maid's son. He was living proof that talent and effort can't be bought. Elias turned his attention to the contract. His small fingers traced each symbol as if they were pieces of a puzzle only he could put together. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the air conditioning and the slight creaking of chairs when an executive shifted uncomfortably. Then, with the calm of someone revealing something obvious, Elias raised his voice. Here's the mistake. This section doesn't add up. If signed as is, the company will lose millions in investments. The revelation fell like a bombshell in the room. Executives exchanged shocked looks, and some began leafing through copies of the contract as if seeking confirmation of the boy's discovery. Augustus froze. For a moment, he tried to maintain a superior posture, but the cold sweat that was beginning to run down his forehead betrayed his discomfort. The boy had discovered something that renowned experts had missed. One of the foreign investors leaned forward, his eyes wide with astonishment. "He's right," he murmured softly, but audibly enough to heighten the tension. Suddenly, all the whispering ceased. Every eye was fixed on Elias, the simple boy who was dismantling, line by line, a document that had passed through the hands of millionaire lawyers and consultants. Helena could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her son, the same one who had so often been ignored or treated as invisible, was now exposing before everyone a mistake that could cost them a fortune. Emotion overwhelmed her, but she remained firm, never taking her eyes off him. Elias, for his part, didn't tremble. He wasn't seeking to humiliate anyone, simply telling the truth as it was. "If you correct this, the contract can be closed without risk," he concluded firmly. The phrase echoed in the air like an irrefutable sentence. The weight of his revelation was so great that the room plunged into a mixture of silence and disbelief. And in that instant, everyone realized. The maid's son had seen what no expert had. For a few seconds, the room remained deathly silent. It was as if everyone was trying to process what had just happened. Then, suddenly, an avalanche of voices filled the room. Executives rose from their chairs, hurriedly leafing through pages of the contract, confirming every detail Elias pointed out. Some exclaimed aloud, "He's right," or "How did we not see this before?" while others simply shook their heads, shocked by the clarity with which the boy had revealed the error. The air was charged with excitement and disbelief, and the usual pomp of such meetings gave way to the chaos of an unexpected discovery. One of the foreign consultants, known for his coolness, approached the table and remarked firmly, "That could have destroyed the negotiation. This kid saved the company from catastrophe." The comment fell like a sentence no one dared dispute. The contrast was stark. Men in ties, with degrees and established careers, now bowed before the intelligence of a boy who, until minutes ago, had been invisible. The sound of timid applause began to echo among those present, gradually growing louder. It was impossible to deny the obvious. Elias had become the centerpiece of that room. Augustus, on the other hand, felt the world crumble beneath his feet. His breathing was heavy, and the flush on his face betrayed a mixture of anger and humiliation. He, who had always prided himself on being infallible, now found himself exposed before all his allies and investors. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Every attempt to downplay the boy's achievement was drowned out by the growing euphoria of the audience. Helena, still motionless in the doorway, discreetly wiped away her tears. For the first time, she saw powerful businessmen recognize her son not as the maid's son, but as someone indispensable. Augustus's empire was trembling, and Elias, without even realizing it, was the one causing the earthquake. Augustus sat motionless, as if trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The contract he had always carried as proof of his intelligence and authority was now being dismantled by the hands of a 13-year-old boy. His face alternated between the red of anger and the pale of disbelief. He tried to maintain his composure, but the arrogant gleam in his eyes had already faded. With each new compliment to Elias, he felt the power slipping from his grasp, like fine sand slipping through his fingers. The millionaire opened his mouth, ready to unleash another ironic quip, but his voice remained silent. It was as if the weight of the collective silence had silenced him. The investors, who had previously regarded him as an undisputed leader, now ignored his presence. All attention was focused on the boy who, without asking for anything, had earned genuine respect. Augustus, for the first time in years, was not the center of the room. He was just a man sitting, watching his own authority crumble. The shame burned brighter than any financial defeat he had ever faced. Helena observed every detail, feeling a strange mixture of compassion and justice. She knew Augustus wouldn't go down in silence, but at that moment he was weaponless. The pride that had always been his greatest armor now became his greatest weakness. The executives avoided his gaze, as if he had nothing left to offer. And while Augustus sank into his own shock, Elias remained standing, firm and calm, holding the contract as if it were just another notebook. The contrast was devastating. The powerful millionaire cowered, while the maid's son grew tall before everyone's eyes. The silence that hung over the room was broken by a single, unexpected, and loud sound: applause. Everyone turned toward the source, and there stood Charles Winthrop, one of the most influential investors present, clapping his hands with conviction. It wasn't a timid or formal applause, but a decisive gesture filled with genuine admiration. For a moment, the entire room hesitated, as if unsure how to react. But soon, one by one, the others began to join in. First a small group, then another, until the entire room echoed in applause that shook the glass and polished wood walls. Elias froze. His eyes, accustomed to seeing only contempt and indifference, now encountered something he had never experienced before: recognition. The men in ties, who minutes before had mocked his boldness, now clapped for him, some even rising from their chairs in a sign of respect. It was as if the entire weight of an invisible life had been lifted from his shoulders in that instant. Helena, standing at the door, raised her hand to her face to hold back the tears that were already flowing freely. Her son was at the center of something grand, and she knew this was only the beginning. Augustus, however, remained seated, rigid as a statue, unable to react. The sound of the clapping hit him like hammer blows, each one shattering his authority a little further. The one who had always been the object of admiration and reverence was now ignored, eclipsed by the unexpected light of a simple boy. He looked around, searching for an ally who shared his indignation, but all he saw were smiles, nodding heads, and glances fixed on Elias. The millionaire felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it was like to be on the wrong side of history. And with each clap that echoed, his defeat became clearer. The applause slowly faded, but the energy in the room remained electric, as if everyone was still stunned by what they had just witnessed. When silence returned, it wasn't to make room for Augustus, but for something even greater. Several investors began to chatter among themselves, loudly praising the boy's talent, oblivious to the millionaire's presence. "This kid is a prodigy," one murmured. "I've never seen anything like him," added another. All eyes were on Elias, and Augustus's authority evaporated before everyone's eyes. It was at that moment that Victoria Langley, an internationally renowned businesswoman known for investing in young talent, rose from the table and walked to the center of the room. Her heels echoed across the marble floor, imposing an immediate silence. She looked at Elias with a discreet but respectful smile. "We can't let a talent like that go to waste," she said firmly, looking directly at the other investors. The phrase wasn't a suggestion, it was a sentence. Their eyes turned to Elias as if they suddenly saw in him not just a boy, but a future impossible to ignore. Augustus tried to stand up and regain control, but it was too late. The room was decided. The admiration that had previously been directed at him now belonged to Elias. The millionaire, who had always prided himself on shaping destinies with his money, realized that in that moment he was facing someone who didn't need fortune to earn respect. Investors, who had always judged people by their bank balance, were now talking about opportunities, scholarships, and development programs for the Maid's son. The turnaround was complete, and there was nothing Augustus could do to stop it. Victoria Langley took a few more steps until she was very close to Elias. The height difference, the imposing presence, and the weight of the silence that accompanied her could have intimidated anyone, but the boy stood firm, holding the contract in his hands. She extended her own hand, not to take the document, but to shake it. "You have something no degree can buy," she said with conviction. Determination, courage, and a rare intelligence. As she uttered those words, the entire room hung in suspense, as if witnessing a historic moment. Elias, surprised, shook her hand respectfully, and the gesture drew murmurs of approval from all around. Victoria then turned to the other investors and announced, "I, personally, will sponsor this boy's education. He will have access to the best schools, the best teachers, and nothing will stop him from achieving the place he deserves." The announcement fell like a thunderclap. Some immediately clapped, others nodded in agreement, while Elias's eyes widened, unable to believe what he was hearing. Helena brought her hands to her face, trying to hold back tears. It was as if all the sleepless nights, all the sacrifices, all the pain of a hard life had suddenly transformed into the promise of a bright future for her son. Meanwhile, Augustus remained motionless, as if he'd been torn from his own throne. The man who had always controlled every decision in that room now watched, helpless, as another destiny unfolded before everyone. With every word Victoria spoke, he felt his influence crumble. There was no more laughter, no more irony. The laughter had shifted, and now, all that was left for him was to face the fact that his arrogance had been defeated by the truth of a humble boy. Elias, head held high, took a deep breath. The impossible was happening before his eyes. Helena could no longer hold back her tears. She dropped the cleaning cloth to the floor and ran to her son, ignoring all the stares in her direction. The hall, once a stage of power and arrogance, now witnessed a simple and genuine gesture. A mother embracing her son with all the strength of someone who had always believed in him, even when the whole world despised him. Elias shrank into her arms, and in that moment, he was no longer just the child prodigy who had silenced millionaires. He was a beloved, recognized, and valued son. The contrast between his mother's simple uniform and the crystal chandeliers on the ceiling made the scene shine even brighter. The applause resumed, now more intense, as if everyone wanted to be part of this historic moment. Victoria Langley, smiling with satisfaction, stood watching the scene, while foreign investors nodded in agreement, already discussing in hushed tones how they could support the boy's future. Elias, still hugging his mother, looked up with tearful eyes and saw dozens of people looking at him not with contempt, but with genuine respect. It was the first time he felt the weight of being seen not for the circumstances he was born into, but for the talent and courage he carried. Augustus, sitting silently, seemed smaller than ever. The man who had always insisted on asserting himself through the power of money could now barely look up. He knew there was nothing more he could do. The maid's son, the one who should have been nothing more than a shadow in his mansion, had become the center of the story. And before everyone, Helena and Elias proved that dignity and truth are stronger than any fortune. The entire room witnessed not only the fall of arrogant pride, but also the birth of a new future. The impossible had happened, and everyone knew they would never forget that day. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share. This way, you'll help us bring you more moving stories that impact and transform lives. Thank you so much for your support.